Um, So 70% of China's trade with the region is concentrated in the 6 states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, so Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait and so forth. Those, of course, were not places, with the exception of Bahrain, where the youth uprisings of 2011 and after had so much purchase. Chinese companies have invested about $30 billion in the region in the past decade, including in telecommunications, and even they're making malls. I was in Beijing in March, and there's this one road in downtown Beijing, which is high-end mall. It's a high-end mall. It's Nordstrom's and all of these things. And you see the Chinese youth, and they're wearing jeans, and they've got the iPods in their ears. But when I talked to them, they kept quoting Mao at me. I didn't think that probably they're doing anything that Mao would have appreciated, but they still give his proverbs, and many of them are just kind of self-help about being confident in yourself and so forth. But I just thought that the public discourse and the actuality of the mall culture haven't meshed yet. But in any case, the Chinese are going to bring some of that to the Arab world. Chinese policy in the region is being shaped by 2 major initiatives of the Communist Party of Xi Jinping, the Go Out imperative and the New Silk Road. These are 2 distinct policies. The Go Out imperative is because Chinese labor is now becoming expensive in real terms. There are lots of places you could put a factory to make things where you could get the labor cheaper than in China. The Chinese middle class has burgeoned. And so forth. And so it is thought by the party that it's now beginning to be time to offshore some of the manufacturing in order for the companies to benefit from cheap labor elsewhere. So that's Go Out. And of course, there's lots of cheap labor to be had in the general vicinity of China. And the Middle East is one of those places. And the other major initiative is the New Silk Road, to take the countries of Central Asia, the Middle East, which in the old days were the overland trade routes into China for luxury goods, because luxury goods were light, and so you could take them in caravans. Anything heavy you have to put on a ship. So it was the high-end light goods, spices and silk and things like that went over the Silk Road. And that was, of course, an extremely important trade artery for centuries. The Chinese want to rebuild it, so that's part of the Pakistan project, which is to make a rail link from Karachi all the way up into Xinjiang. And from some cities in Xinjiang, I calculated this, it's 2,000 miles from them to Karachi. It's 4,000 miles from them to Shanghai, which is China's major port. So actually, you would save a lot of money by using Karachi as your port, and that's what the Chinese are going to do. That New Silk Road will include the Arab world and Egypt and so forth. China has a zero problems foreign policy. It wants to concentrate on economic growth and harmonious relations with other countries. And so for that reason did not, in any significant way attempt to intervene in dramatic developments in the Middle East of 2011, 2013. And I think its policies were driven by 3 major considerations. First of all, the thing I want to underline is I see China as extremely pragmatic. So some people have suggested, some analysts have suggested that, well, China didn't like the Arab Spring or the youth uprisings because it didn't want that to spread to China, and that's certainly true. But China doesn't really care. A country is democratic, is not democratic. They want to know, can you make money there? And so Pakistan, which is one of China's major foreign policy allies, is undergone a fairly significant democratic transition in the past decade. It went from military rule to People's Party government, and then had the first civilian transition to another civilian government in a couple years ago, and now is ruled by the Muslim League. That Pakistan has taken the democratic road doesn't mean anything at all in Beijing terms. That's the government they want to put $45 billion into. So I don't think the Chinese really cared very much whether Egypt has got regular parliamentary elections or not. They would prefer it not to be unstable, obviously. So I want to emphasize that there's this pragmatic element. And likewise, China is eyeing Morocco as an arena of investment. And again, Morocco is one of those countries that's maybe taken some small steps towards greater popular sovereignty. But I will admit, as point number two, that China was eager not to see the techniques of the youth revolutionaries deployed in China itself. Third, the big changes in the region have put China in play, or have put the big changes in the region have put it in play as an arena of great power rivalry. So from China's point of view, the really disappointing thing that happened was that Libya had been, you could say, a kind of BRICS sphere of influence. This idea of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as a kind of alternative bloc to the Western G7, and Libya had been more kind of in the BRICS sphere of influence. And because of the no-fly zone and the way that NATO used it, really not just as a humanitarian protection for civilians, but as a means to overthrow Gaddafi, Libya went, from China's point of view, into a NATO sphere of influence, and they were very unhappy about this outcome because China had abstained from the UN Security Council resolution and allowed it to go forward on Libya, thinking that it was supported by the Arab League and China was willing to defer to the Arab League on this matter, and B, that it was mainly a humanitarian measure. But then when it became power politics, they object. And so it's been argued that experience with Libya then later influenced their position towards Syria. So when a similar Arab League push was made to get a no-fly zone over Syria, both China and Russia vetoed it because they felt that the no-fly zone is actually just a stalking horse for turning Syria into a NATO playground.
I argue that there are three historical phases in which we saw three different kinds of structures in the state of Egypt. And the first one, I call it the consolidation. The consolidation is, you can think of Nasser's regime, you can think of central states, strong central states that has not just authority and dictatorship, they have strong army, they have strong national project, they have state-run economy, they have very strong bureaucracy, they own things, they own factories, they own the lands, and they pay money to those people, and this is how the state was run. I call it the consolidation, or the consolidated state. Then the polarized state, I argue that the privatization policies of the 1970s, started by President Sadat, created changes, and those changes ended up by him being assassinated by his own army, because he created conflicts within the state itself. I also focus on the state, and I minimize the importance of the opposition. I see the opposition, again, in the case of Egypt, as forming some different forums for the production of discourses, like socialist discourse, Marxian discourse, liberal discourse, whatever kind of discourse. But why the state is stable, the state of Gamal Abdel Nasser or Sadat, is because they absorb all these kind of discourses, then they do kind of negotiation inside the ruling party itself, and eventually all their decisions is a kind of compromise. And I always argue that the Egyptian state never had an ideology, even when, maybe especially when they claim they have one. They never had one. It's always a compromise. When Mubarak came, he realized that he cannot be so strong, stronger than the army, And what he did is that he changed the structure in Egypt, the structure of the state, and he changed and redefined his own function as a president. What he did is that, well, it seems like it's too dangerous to be president in this country, so he stepped back, he created a liberal elite, and then he let these two elite parts, two centers of power within the state, not state and opposition, both of them within the state. You have two sets of laws. You have two people who are, both of them have businessmen, both of them have economic power, both of them have political power, both of them are represented and fighting against each other within the state of Egypt, within the same ruling party. And then he changed his position. So instead of he is a ruler, he became the arbiter. So they fight, they come back to him, this time you're right, the second time, no, you take this thing. You can see this in many details, but I have no time for details. But just to tell you that we have a different kind of structure of the state, and I call it the polarized state. Then, in 2008, they tried, they didn't quite succeed, but they tried and to move from the polarized state. He realized that he will not last for long, and I doubt very much that he wanted his son to be the president. I don't think that that was his plan at all. But again, you can ask me later on about this. But he wanted to move to a new structure, and I call it the decentralization, the decentralized structure. And many people don't or never read something that's called أوراق السياسات. It's the papers of policies, where the Egyptian state published, this is our vision of the future. And it's just ignored. I never heard about anyone who read it or he wrote a paper about it. But it's very important because in this vision, they are speaking openly about a semi-presidential state, about redefinition of the parliament, about creating another parliament. So one of them is Majlis al-Shab, the other one is Majlis al-Shura, and that these two chambers have two different rules, so that one of them will support the prime minister, the other one will support the president. It's a fantastic vision that was lost, and you will not find it on the internet because the website itself has long gone.
Although Gaddafi had demonstrated his willingness to cooperate with neoliberal doctrines, desires, and requirements to a significant extent, there were still myriad inconveniences and barriers for private corporations to overcome before Libya could be considered a serious ally of capital accumulation and neoliberal doctrine. While his son Saif al-Islam was publicly touting the benefits of neoliberal policies by 2008 and encouraging technocrats from the diaspora to return to Libya for a neoliberal transformation, there was a limit to possible changes while Gaddafi remained in power, which led the West to view Gaddafi and his regime as unreliable at best. Despite many of the Libyan neoliberal reformists siding with the NTC during the NATO intervention, Saif al-Islam's loyalties remained with his father's regime. Gaddafi managed to nest himself halfway between Western allied autocrat and intransigent nationalist, an inconsistency most distressing to the West. His less pronounced yet still evident nationalist tendencies and the reality of Libya as the largest African welfare state were not ultimately suited to business interests, and it was this that played a significant role in sealing his fate once the Libyan people began to voice their own, albeit different grievances against him. This reaction represents remarkable continuity with a declassified U.S. policy guideline for the Arab world from 1958, a desire to, quote, guide the revolutionary and nationalistic pressures throughout the area into orderly channels which will not be antagonistic to the West. NATO discernment of a level of anger and mobilization against the Gaddafi regime culminated in government forces combating protesters in Benghazi, which ultimately led to its intervention on the side of the rebels. After this sign of affirmation, the UN passed Security Council Resolution 1973, less than 2 weeks after Abdul Jalil declared his leadership, to protect Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's forces. The UN's Security Council resolution was essential for NATO, as it authorized a no-fly zone over Libya, enforced an arms embargo, froze the assets of the Libyan authorities, and allowed for military intervention. That NATO's concern lied with Gaddafi's removal from power, rather than civilian protection, is demonstrated by its dismissal of the African Union's proposal for a negotiated peace settlement. Gaddafi and his government accepted the AU's roadmap in April 2011, which was ignored by NATO forces in favor of maintaining the bombing campaign. This bombing created greater threats toward civilians. When the rebels and their NATO supporters proceeded to target Sirte, Bani Walid, and other regime strongholds, they in fact created a threat to civilians where none existed before, and there was nobody to protect the residents of Sirte from NATO and local allies other than what remained of the so-called Gaddafi forces. Maximilian Forte rightly asks why the threat of potential massacre of civilians in Benghazi elicited significantly greater outrage than the actual massacre of civilians in Sirte, and why Benghazi mattered more than Sirte. The answer lies in NATO opportunistically utilizing Gaddafi's threat toward Benghazi civilians to advance its own interests, while ignoring the plight of civilians in Sirte, Gaddafi's hometown, and a stronghold of support for his regime. Attempts for peace such as the AU roadmap were spurned largely because of the different interests NATO powers had in Libya, and civilian slaughter in Sirte was ignored because those interests were distant from the pretext of civilian protection. The three countries leading the NATO push, the US, England, and France, had different intentions behind intervention. The US did not have as large of an interest in Libya's resources as Europe, since Libyan oil accounted for a mere 0.6% of US oil imports at the time of the intervention. Although the amount of physical oil delivered to the US from Libya was marginal, the production of Libyan oil affects the prices of world markets, and along with other major oil reserves, must be kept flowing to maintain low oil prices and to enable industrial society to proceed at its exponential pace. While cables reveal desires for future investment opportunities in Libya, another important factor behind U.S. support for intervention was Libya setting what has been termed the threat of a good example with its sizable welfare state. The U.S. has historically acted against the threat of progressive regimes in countries as varied as Laos, Grenada, and Nicaragua, among others. Gaddafi's Libya as a model for a semi-socialist welfare state certainly fit into this pattern, and the discomfort it evoked among the U.S. establishment is palpable in confidential cables. What if Gaddafi's example could inspire a truly progressive regime in the region without the blemish of a violent autocrat at its helm? Given its past mobilization against such examples, this question no doubt informed U.S. actions once the opportunity of a Libya without Gaddafi presented itself. The European countries England and France had a much more pronounced interest in Libya than the U.S. because of oil and immigration. While Gaddafi was still in power, the EU imported about 10% of its oil from Libya, a fact which helps illustrate England and France's desire for a more cooperative regime handling a resource on which their economies are dependent. The fact that Libyan oil is of very high quality, easily accessible, and close to Europe only made it more attractive. On the matter of immigration, Europeans feared not only a massive wave from Libya if Gaddafi continued his violence, but also a massive wave from sub-Saharan Africa if government control over Libya's ports broke down. These factors are essential for contextualizing the intervention and help explain how the different interests of the US and European countries could converge on Libya. In order to determine the validity of NATO's stated claim of civilian protection, it seems that a fair standard to judge it by is its reaction to civilian deaths. Human Rights Watch reported the finding of 53 bodies of apparent Gaddafi supporters, all in the same small space of an abandoned hotel, some with bound hands, and all in the same stages of decomposition, suggesting they had been killed at the same time. Additionally, in the chaos after Gaddafi's death, militias were active in terrorizing inhabitants of towns they believed were loyal to him. According to another Human Rights Watch report, Tawerga, which was used as a base by Gaddafi forces until they were forced to flee in August 2011, had been targeted by these militias, and Tawergans reported serious abuses, including arbitrary arrests, beatings, and some killings. The responsibility to protect was mysteriously absent for Tawergans, civilians who happened to not be on the side of the rebels. It would be unfair to completely attribute these and many other grisly anecdotes solely to the NTC or NATO while absolving Gaddafi's government. However, the fact that there was no pressure from NATO and no internal investigation of NTC members who were responsible for lynching dozens of captured soldiers and suspected foreign mercenaries after taking control of eastern Libya speaks volumes both about NATO's supposed intentions of protecting civilians and the legitimacy of the NTC.
So basically, humanitarian intervention, if you're not already familiar, is just an authoritative exercise done by a state or a group of states against another state without its approval of that action. So basically, it's also it's an infringement on sovereignty, but it's done in the sense that this authoritative exercise is actually done before and after the intervention itself. So the intervening states do not always anticipate the consent of the state they plan to intervene in, and they do not have to plan. There is no obligation to actually plan their intervention efforts or coordinate it with the state that they're intervening in. At the same time, there is this implicit statement made that if there is a return to pre-intervention conditions, then the intervention could actually happen again or be reinstated. So this very much suggests that there has been a change in global norms in terms of and rules of international conduct. So sovereignty is no more viewed as an authority, but rather as a responsibility within each state. Now, to come back to utilitarianism and consequentialist utilitarianism, so basically utilitarianism is a tradition of normative ethics. It's concerned with utility, with well-being, specifically maximizing that welfare or utility. Consequentialist utilitarianism would then be concerned with whether humanitarian intervention is actually not whether it should actually happen or not, but whether it should happen considering the consequences that we could see unfold after that intervention. And that's pretty important for Libya because, as we all know, after the intervention, things didn't exactly go as planned, either by the revolutionaries who began the uprising or by the NATO forces that started the intervention. So, the important thing to say about utilitarians or utilitarianism is that it does not totally dismiss war as immoral. There are justifiable wars, so there's the just war theory coming into place over here, and it actually just war theory and utilitarianism would find it acceptable if there's unintentional killing of civilians during war. Now, the important thing also to mention is that if we extrapolate on the utilitarian argument, and that's what I tried to do over here, we could claim that a failure to protect a civilian from a foreseen death during a war is equivalent to killing that civilian. Now, if you don't maximize utility, then you could passively act in favor of not protecting those citizens. So instead of taking an action, when you fail to take action, it's as if you have actually contributed passively to the killing of those civilians. So basically, one of the scholars that I looked into while doing this research, Terry Norden, they stated that humanitarian intervention would actually be morally justified, inclusive of the infringement on sovereignty, if that intervention actually stops another moral crime. So these would include genocide, massacring innocent civilians, etc. And that's probably what we have been seeing in Libya. So there is another important point that I have to bring up about the intervention, which is the fact that one of its less considered consequences is the fact that it actually legitimized the UN. It legitimized the role of the UN in terms of humanitarian intervention, in terms of what the United Nations Security Council could do or should do. I'm sure many would remember that it was a big scandal for the UN not to do anything about Rwanda, not to possibly be able to stop what happened in the former Yugoslavia during the 90s. And so there was again this aim, perhaps by the UN, when it ordered, or when it actually authorized, as it says here. This is one of the articles from the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973, which was passed in 2011, and it clearly states I'm not sure if this works. So it clearly states that it authorizes that all necessary measures be taken in order to protect civilians. But what also caught my interest or my attention was that it very much overemphasizes this idea of notifying the security, notifying the Secretary General. And it actually does that in quite a number of places. So requests the member states concerned to inform the Secretary General, and then which shall be immediately reported to the Security Council. It's as if they're trying to say, well, we're important, we're here, we need to actually play a role in this and set a precedent. Now, again, what caught my attention after that is that even though we haven't, even though there is a utility that is to be gained from that intervention, there is also costs, which the consequentialist utilitarian ethic does not exactly seem to be troubled with. So when this utility is extended to political interest, the literature for me seemed silent with regards to that. And one of the scholars, Eric Hines, stated it in a rather eloquent way for me. He said, consequentialist utilitarian ethic would then be concerned with the balance of benefits and costs. So it's not only benefit to the party that they're intervening in, but there are also costs that have to be considered, and it's okay to consider them. That there's nothing wrong in considering the costs or what the intervening party is going to gain from that intervention, besides, of course, the moral and the humanitarian good things that we all know about. So one important point that I've also found with regards to R2P, which again I found R2P to be a tool of limited success in addressing. So R2P would say that there's a responsibility to protect, there's a responsibility to intervene when there's a catastrophic situation. But then again, it seems like R2P is also suggesting that if there is urgency in interfering in a place, then it's okay to actually rush intervention without adequate consideration of long-term implications. And I think this is a very dangerous point and a very less studied point or understudied point. Because in Libya's situation, and definitely many other situations, there are long-term implications to intervention. There are post-intervention consequences that would make a lot of difference and might actually affect the initial decision. They might actually affect whether you're going to intervene or not. So I think this is important to be studied, and it has to be considered much more carefully, whether in the academic debates, whether in studying Libya's intervention or whether in policy in considering future interventions.